Hello and welcome to our latest webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, I hope you're all well and staying safe during this tricky time. We're going to take a slow start to the webinar. I can see the numbers rising quite quickly. So very briefly, an introduction to me. My name's Phil Underwood, Engagement Manager here at the Society for the Environment. You don't need to know much about me, apart from if you have any questions after the webinar, please use the contact details on your screen at the moment, and I should be able to get back to you in some way. So very quickly, you're watching a Society for the Environment webinar. We hold the 2 professional registrations for environmental professionals, and that is the Chartered Environmentalist or CEnv register and the Registered Environmental Technician or REnvTech register. The Society operates as an umbrella organisation, currently made up of 24 professional bodies known as our licensed members. All of these professional bodies hold a license granted by the Society to award the CEnv registration to their members. 3 of these also offer the REnvTech registration to their members, and they are highlighted on your screen now. To become a CEnv or REnvTech, you'll need to be a member of and apply via one of these professional bodies. You'll be joining nearly 7,500 registrants across sectors and disciplines. If you want to find out more about becoming a CEnv or an REnvTech, visit socenv.org.uk or inquire with the relevant professional body directly. So moving swiftly on, the numerous webinars at CEnv series that we're running are designed to provide perspectives from across the wide knowledge spectrum that is our CEnv and REnvTech registrant base and the sectors that they cover. This is to increase knowledge transfer opportunities for environmental professionals and interested parties. The webinar is, well, this webinar is the second of a 4-part series based on the topic of climate change, a 2020 perspective. Today we're focusing on environmental impact assessments and how they fit into the climate change challenge. So today's speaker is Joanna Wright, mentioned earlier, who is Director of Environmental Planning at LUC, also known as Land Use Consultants. She is a Chartered Environmentalist via EIA, which is the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and a Fellow of EIA as well. So a huge welcome to Joanna. Are you with us? Can you hear me?
I am, thanks Phil. Is that okay?
Yes, I can hear you as well. So that's good. So thank you very much for joining us today to provide your insights. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to hand straight over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Phil. I think that's some of the bit I was most worried about, not being the best in technology. So I feel already I can breathe a huge sigh of relief that everybody can hear me.
Good.
So thank you for that. And yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's afternoon. So thanks for the introduction, Phil. I think you said the most important bits really. Yeah, just to recap, yes, I'm a Director of Environmental Planning at LUC. I will be with LUC for 27 years next month. And LUC is a planning, environmental assessment, landscape design, ecology and geospatial consultancy. I've worked in our London and Glasgow offices, so just to let you know, I'm speaking to you today from sunny Glasgow, and it's kind of sunny here at the moment, clouding over a bit. So my interest in this subject, hesitate to call myself an expert, but I'll certainly say my interest in this subject is twofold. I undertook one of the very early MSCs in EIA, graduating way back in 1993. And then more recently, what I sometimes call my midlife crisis, I was part of the first intake for the online MSc in carbon management from the University of Edinburgh, a course I can certainly recommend. And I studied that over 3 years, graduating in 2018. So that's really where I'm coming from. Anyway, what am I going to talk about? We'll try to work on the moving the slides. It doesn't seem to work quite the same as when I tested it. So addressing climate change in environmental impact assessment. So what, why, and how well are we doing? Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I am intending to give a brief introduction to environmental impact assessment, to talk about why climate change is now included in EIA, touch upon the guidance available and the competency which ideally people should have. I'm going to talk briefly about the factors that should be considered at the different stages of EIA, I'm going to provide a practical project example, and I'm going to finish with some key challenges and some good practice pointers. Now, it was maybe a little tricky to decide how to pitch this, because some of you may be EIA specialists that want to know more about how to incorporate climate change. Some of you might be climate change specialists that want to know more about the role of EIA. Some may be neither. You may have a more generalised interest, or quite frankly, at the moment, it's maybe just that you can't get self-raising flour for your lockdown baking. Hopefully it's not that reason. I've been asked to speak for about 30 to 35 minutes to allow time for questions, so I will certainly do my very best to comply with that. I'm quietly confident. There will be a UK focus, and I'm aware there are a number of registrants that are from outside the UK, but hopefully this will still be relevant. Processes are broadly the same worldwide, and well, climate change is certainly a global issue. So firstly, just a quick recap on what EIA is. So it's originated in the US and the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. I like to think it was an important year because it was the year I was born. So the act was signed by President Nixon, and it's been described as the Magna Carta of federal environmental laws. It requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of proposed major federal actions prior to making decisions. So it's still in operation, and as some of you may know, it's not particularly well loved by Trump. So it's existed in the UK for a while now, probably since the early 70s, but it was formally introduced in the UK through an EU directive in '85, which is shown there, which meant it had to be implemented by 1988. Now, there are lots of different definitions of what EIA is, but they're all broadly similar. Being based in Scotland these days, I've picked one from the Scottish Government. So I will just read it out, but I will particularly want to focus on the text which I've highlighted myself in bold. So EIA is a means of drawing together in a systematic way an assessment of a project's likely significant environmental effects. This helps to ensure that the importance of the predicted effects and the scope for reducing any adverse effects are properly understood by the public and the competent authority before it makes its decision. So a few points here. It's a systematic process, so it's prescribed and quite orderly, although it gets quite chaotic. And EIA practitioners love a flow chart, albeit there are many feedback loops, so it's not really all a one-way street. Likely significant effects, this is really important. The purpose of EIA is not to look at every single effect that could happen, but just to look at those that are likely to be significant to ensure a proportionate assessment. This is quite tricky, always quite tricky to determine what a significant effect is likely to be, but it's especially tricky when you're looking at climate change, and we'll come back to this. So it should look at the scope for reducing any adverse effects. The idea is that you don't design your development, then they assess the effects and say, well, these are the effects, we can't do anything about it. It should be a positive design tool that helps you to reduce your environmental effects. And finally, it doesn't make the decision, and it doesn't advise on what the decision should be. But what it does do is provide information, if undertaken properly, on what the significant environmental effects are likely to be, so those that are engaged and involved in the decision have the required information before they're making that decision. Okay, so what projects require EIA? The EIA directive, it has two schedules or two annexes. Now, the first is Annex 1, and that's mandatory. So for projects listed in Annex 1, you have to take an EIA for it. Now, these are kind of the big hitters, such as motorways, nuclear power stations, airports. It gets a bit more complicated for Annex 2, but Annex 2 lists a range of project types where EIA may be required, although case law does suggest some flexibility, so these are not to be applied too rigidly, because you sometimes find you've got a project that doesn't neatly fit in one of these categories. But the kind of categories are things such as wind farms, larger housing developments, maybe urban development, mixed use and tourist developments. Now here you will have thresholds. For example, it's 0.5 hectare for tourist development. So if you have a tourist development and it's over 0.5 hectare, you do have to consider through a process called screening whether it's likely to have significant effects on the environment by virtue of its nature, size or location. Just to complicate matters, if your project is in what's defined as a sensitive area, such as a national park, if it's in that list of project types, you have to screen it for EIA irrespective. You don't have to worry about the thresholds. So the directive's implemented in the UK, and we'll come back to Brexit, through a series of regulations. For example, there are different regulations for planning, for energy, for transport, for forestry, and for land drainage. And each of there's English regulations, and the devolved administrations all have their own regulations. So if you put them together, that's quite a large bundle of regulations, although I think it's reasonable to say they're all broadly similar. So in terms of what you have to look at in the EIA, this is determined through a process called scoping, and there's a number of topics here that you have to look at to see whether there are going to be likely significant effects in relation to these topic areas. And these topic areas include subjects such as population and human health, flora and fauna or biodiversity, land, water, air, cultural heritage and landscape. The directive is regularly updated, and it was most recently updated in 2014, which meant it had to be implemented by 2017. So yeah, we thought Brexit was a thing that was going to shake us all up, and we're now shaken up in all sorts of ways. So we're not quite sure what will change and when it will change. So at the moment, I think it's fair to say business as usual as much as it can be, but there are likely to be some subtle changes. We don't think EIA will go away in its entirety, but there may be some subtle changes or some departures, and also maybe between the way the different administrations within the UK deal with EIA, but we're pretty sure, and we hope that it's here to stay. Okay, so next, so why consider climate change? So the updated directive of 2014, there's two reasons really, and these are, I've summarised the extracts from the preamble on the slide. So firstly, over the last decade, environmental issues such as climate change have become more important in policy making, so should therefore also constitute important elements in assessment and decision-making processes. So this makes sense, basically saying if you're looking at climate change at the policy level and investing all that effort, it makes no sense if you then don't look at it when you look at the projects that are being implemented on the ground. Secondly, climate change will continue to cause damage to the environment and compromise economic development. In this regard, it is appropriate to assess the impacts of projects on climate, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, and their vulnerability to climate change. So I think what this is really saying is, and it makes total sense, is you can't separate out climate change from a consideration of environmental impacts. Climate change has environmental impacts of its own. It can make other predicted environmental impacts worse. A new development can also influence our ability to adapt to climate change. So where does it come in? So it appears in Article 3 of the directive, which lists the different topics that you need to look at, and it's the one that's particularly relevant is there under C, which is land, soil, water, air and climate. Now, interestingly, the new directive, it's not new anymore, I guess, also introduced a requirement to consider the risk of major accidents and disasters. Specifically for EIA, it's actually the potential to have likely significant effects which would result from the vulnerability of a project to a major accident or disaster. And you can see there that under those considerations, that includes those caused by climate change. So it appears in a couple of places. So just to recap on definitions, and I'm sure everybody knows these, but it gets a little bit confusing when we talk about EIA. So climate adaptation is the process that a receptor or project has to go through to ensure it maintains its resilience to climate change. Climate mitigation or climate change mitigation refers to measures included in a project to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, and so far so good. But when we come to EIA and we talk about mitigation, which is mitigating effects, is a key part of EIA. EIA mitigation could apply to both of these. For example, if you had a suds pond to mitigate flood risk, that's EIA mitigation, but it's not climate change mitigation. So what we're finding, and others I think are finding, is that it's actually easier to talk about when you're looking at this in an EIA to talk about climate adaptation than maybe just to talk about emissions reductions. So what guidance available? So EIA certainly has two key sources of guidance here that were produced, one in advance and one the year that the requirements came in. So you'll see that I've just shown them both there. So there's guidance on mitigation or greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and that was produced by EIA in partnership with ARAP in 2017. I think there may be plans to update that at some point. The second one, which was produced by EIA in partnership with Mott MacDonald in 2015, relates to climate change resilience and adaptation. And I do know that this one is being updated because I'm part of the peer review panel, which is certainly easier than trying to write it yourself. So hats off to Mark McDonald's for that. And if anybody's interested, keep an eye on the EIA website, because the updated guidance is due to be launched next month, and there will be a webinar for that as well. So keep an eye out if you're interested. So competency, I keep calling it the new directive, with the latest, most recent, now says it's a new thing, and the experts involved in the preparation of environmental statements or environmental impact assessment reports should be qualified and competent. There's much debate when the directive came in as to whether it should say a bit more about what qualified and competent means, but there was a general view that that should be left to the relevant countries to decide how to implement that themselves. There's still some debate about what qualified and competent means, but I think it's fair to say what it doesn't really mean is just having a huge pile of CVs that you attach as an appendix to your report. Now, you'll notice there the reference to environmental statements and environmental impact assessment reports, because that was one of the changes that came in with the implementation of the new directive. If you're working, for example, in England or Wales, you'll still be preparing environmental statements. Or if you're working in Scotland, you're now preparing environmental impact assessment reports or EIA reports. So, trying to remember to flip between the two is a bit tricky, but the same thing for all intents and purposes. In relation to climate change specifically, EIA recommends that every team includes a practitioner who is knowledgeable about future climate change scenarios and is experienced in the use and interpretation of future climate projections. So EIA suggests that you might want to have a climate change coordinator. Now, importantly, this doesn't need to be a climate scientist. You don't need that level of expertise. You just need some understanding, familiarity. So it might be that it's someone that supports the overall project manager for an EIA, someone else in the team. And what they should ideally be able to do is to access readily available climate information sources. I've listed some there, particularly UK CP18, which we'll come back to. They should be able to write the contextual background on climate change or work out what's relevant for the environmental statement or EIA report, referring to any relevant policy and documentation. And perhaps most importantly, they should be working with the client and the EIA technical specialists to ensure that climate change is considered in the EIA report chapters appropriately. It's really a theme that runs right through the EIA process, so it needs to be woven throughout the document ideally. For example, it's relevant when you're reviewing alternatives, looking at the project design, considering what your baseline is, particularly with changing conditions, and looking at the resilience of your mitigation measures. So EIA also suggests that the coordinator might want to use a climate change checklist. This is optional, and you may or may not want to include this within your environmental statement or EIA report. And those that are familiar with the EIA use the scoping tables, where you present the information that comes up through the scoping process. It's a similar kind of setup, really. So you want to work out where it kicks in, where climate change kicks in at the different stages, what action is required, informed by consultation at the scoping stage, and also how and where that's addressed in your ES or EIA report. I'm just giving a couple of examples there. Okay, so where are we? Yeah, so I just really want to go through some of the stages now in EIA and what questions you might want to ask. So your EIA screening, really. So this is what do you need to undertake an EIA, and what sort of questions should you be asking? Questions you may want to ask. Are there emerging regulations or policies on climate change that might tip the project in or out of being designated as EIA development? Are predicted greenhouse gas emissions likely to be significant enough to trigger a need for EIA? And here it's important to note there's a new consideration where you are allowed to take into account any proposed mitigation measures that the developer has agreed to. I think it's fair to say there'll be limited occasions where climate change adaptation will be a decisive factor in whether an EIA is required or not, and particularly taking account of mitigation. But because it's important to think of climate change adaptation from the very outset of the design and EIA process, it does no harm to think of adaptation at this stage as well. So the tricky issue of looking at significance of effects and proportionality. This is one definition from the IEMA guidance, which basically argues that because greenhouse gas emissions have a combined environmental effect approaching a scientifically defined environmental limit, any emissions are significant. And because of this, an EIA should ensure that the project addresses their occurrence by taking mitigating action. So there's a reasonably strong logic for this. Having said that, that's not normally kind of the way that you deal with significance in EIA, and you do want to remain proportionate. So there are some other ways you might, and that people are looking at whether an effect will or won't be significant. For example, you could consider whether or not the project will replace an existing development, and if so, will it have a higher or lower greenhouse gas profile than the existing development? For example, are your net emissions positive or negative? Can your predicted emissions be compared against defined carbon budgets or reduction targets at a national, regional, or local or sector-specific level, which enables you to contextualize the project's impact by developing a sense of the scale of the greenhouse gas emissions anticipated? Or thirdly, how is the project expected to perform against legal and/or policy standards, such as the building regs or development plan policy for sustainable construction and on-site renewable? And will the project comply, exceed, or fall short of any of these? So these are other ways of thinking about what may or may not be significant. For adaptation, in terms of project resilience, interestingly, we are seeing, for example, some developments are starting to be refused planning permission due to concerns over overheating, which suggests there is a significant effect there, which may or may not have been properly considered. There's an interesting appeal decision that people may be aware of relating to retirement homes in Bristol. That was it was decided in January 2019, and ultimately the development was refused permission because of concerns over overheating. In addition, that you have to look at in combination effects. For example, could need to give consideration as to whether climate change could exacerbate the likely significance of an existing impact of the project to such an extent that you've got new significant effects. Okay, so in terms of understanding what your baseline for assessment is and how that might change, I just want to maybe quickly run through a few things to do with, because this is really the recommended way to do it. So the IEMA guidance recommends looking at the UK CP18 projections that people may well be familiar with. It updates the last ones of 2009, UK CP09, and they're produced by the Met Office. And really it's the most up-to-date assessment of how the climate of the UK may change. So a few things, they're probabilistic, they're not predictions. There's too many uncertainties for them to be predictions as such. And they look at a range of variables that include temperature, precipitation, and sea level. There's also information on wind speed, storm frequency, and intensity, but they're considered separately because the global modelling information about these is more limited. But they are important because it's important to capture the extreme events, not just the kind of the more incremental changes. So there's three variables: time frame. The projections are presented for 4 overlapping time periods, and as they roll forward the projections, obviously they go further into the future. Probability, probability distributions with a range from a 5% probability to a 95, with 50 being a central estimate. So it doesn't mean it's the most likely, but it's a reasonable place to start, but maybe look at the ranges as well. And it looks at a range of representative concentration pathways, which were in the previous version in 2009, the emission scenarios. So there's 4 pathways or scenarios, and they're really 4 scenarios for how greenhouse gas emissions may change in future. With each one results in a different range of global mean temperature increases. So there's 4 there that you can choose from. So just quickly, they kind of look like this. If you manage to find it on the website, it can be a bit tricky to find, but if you're on the Met Office website, you find UKCP and you go to key results, then you'll see this here. So you'll see that you can look at it by admin region. You can always also use river basin. You pick your region. It's just an Excel spreadsheet. You've got your variables, mean, winter, summer temperature, same for precipitation. You pick your, one of your 4 time horizons, you pick your emission scenarios, you pick your probability, and you get some results. So it's definitely interesting to play around with. And this really is just one example of how we've used them ourselves. And this is taken from an EIA we did last year for housing development in Billericay in Essex. This was just the kind of overall summary that we used to try and get a handle on how our baseline may change. So you'll see that key point is that for the east of England, projected to increase, and some are greatest. So then we provided the central estimate of the increases, and we did this for the winter and summer temperatures. We did the same for precipitation. So we gave the central, but we also gave the range. And we felt this was an appropriate level of detail just to give a handle on how our baseline may change with climate change. Okay, so you've got your baseline of changing climate. How do you do your impact assessment? Now, greenhouse gas emissions, 3 things really you want to look at. Direct emissions, for example, from vehicles and plant during construction, operation and decommissioning, such as carbon dioxide and nitrogen oxide. You want to look at your indirect emissions in these phases, and these arise from the demand for energy produced using fossil fuels. And the third, which is a form of indirect, is also the embodied carbon, which comes, for example, from the extraction and manufacture of the materials that you're using in construction and their fabrication and transport to site. For example, if you're using concrete, then it contains embodied carbon. So how do you do this? This is tricky, and there's lots of constructive debate about how to do this at the moment, particularly given that these projects are at a very early stage of design and lack detailed information, and they may or may not be consented, which affects the information I think you can reasonably expect someone to work up at that stage. There's no right or wrong, but lots of interesting debates. In some cases, it may be considered necessary to undertake specific modelling and assessment work for the EIA specifically to quantify net greenhouse gas emissions. What we're finding is that in other cases, the gathering of this information may in part be underway to meet other planning or regulatory requirements and is being provided in other application documents, such as an energy strategy or a sustainability statement, and you can draw upon that information. In other cases, a qualitative assessment may be considered the most pragmatic and proportionate, and that's fine too. There may also be a reference to a need for further assessment at subsequent stages should a project be granted consent and more detail becomes available on the overall massing of the development and on the proposed construction materials. I think the key point in all cases is the approach to assessment should be agreed through the scoping process, and that any assessment uncertainties and assumptions should be clearly stated. So, adaptation. Questions you may want to ask, questions such as these. So, are the predicted impacts of the project as assessed by the other topic specialists altered at all due to projected climate change? For example, are any environmental receptors particularly sensitive to climate change, which means that the magnitude of the impact is higher? Or could the scale geographic spread of impact change due to the sensitivity excuse me, the baseline to climate change? And also, how resilient is the project itself to climate change, both in terms of projected changes in average conditions and not forgetting the extreme events? So going back to the bullets and some examples of how climate change may affect your environmental receptors. For example, with air quality, a change in climate can affect the concentration and dispersion of air pollutants. With archaeology, changes in rainfall will alter groundwater and soil conditions and could impact upon below ground archaeology. For ecology, changes in rainfall coupled with rising temperatures are likely to result in shift in species ranges. You're unlikely to leave this to the very end, but in trying to find, it seems a logical place in the presentation to talk about mitigation of effects and monitoring of effects. So here questions you might want to ask is, are there any carbon mitigation measures? For example, is the consideration of energy demand and management, technology or process improvements, management of transport and travel demands for planting and afforestation? Are your mitigation measures that you've identified elsewhere in your document, are they climate proof? Does the mitigation strengthen the project's capacity to be resilient to climate change? And then should carbon management be considered in proposals for an environmental management plan? So in the last 10 minutes, max, if I'm still okay for time, I just really wanted to touch on a case study example and also finish with some good practice pointers and some of the challenges we're facing. So I'm no football expert, so apologies for that, but my case study is the new football stadium for Forest Green Rovers, which has been consented. So Forest Green Rovers Football Club, based near Stroud in Gloucestershire. The chairman and major shareholder since 2010 is Dale Vince from Ecotricity. He's the CEO of Ecotricity. Many of you will know of him. You may not be aware, however, that Forest Green Rovers is one of the oldest football teams in the world, and importantly, it's a very important local employer. So the ambition for the club was for it to be the greenest football team in the world and also in the Championship League within 5 years. I think they're struggling with the latter, but I'll say no football expert. And interestingly, the stadium they've got at the moment, they're already been trying to see how they can promote this as an opportunity for eco sport. So the existing stadium, it's got solar PV on the roof. They use solar powered lawnmowers, and they have an organic and award-winning pitch, and they're the first and quite possibly the only vegan football club in the world. However, this didn't really meet their aspirations to, quote, take sustainable sports to a new level. So because of this, they had a new stadium proposal. So the new football stadium, it got quite a bit of press across the world, designed by Zaha Hadid, so some quite prestigious architects there. So I won't read the design in full, but you'll see that over in the States, it was picked up by CNN News with talk of a millionaire football club owner doing all he can to make his team as environmentally friendly as possible, by building what the chairman says is the world's first ever wooden stadium. So if you move across to what Dale Vince said about it, and he picks up on this point about embodied carbon and the fact that he's chosen to build this stadium out of wood because his argument is it's got about as low as it gets for a building material. And when you bear in mind that around 3/4 of the lifetime carbon impact of a stadium comes from its building materials, that's why it's so important. And you'll see as well, it's set there in a kind of meadow landscape, lots of planting. So how did we get on when we tried to apply EIA to the stadium proposal? This was the very first one that we did, and there weren't many other examples, partly because this was actually a voluntary assessment. It was undertaken in 2017, but without going into the detail, there were transitional arrangements, which meant the new requirement came in gradually, so it wasn't actually required. So it's a voluntary assessment, recognising that the requirement was coming in. So importantly, it did enable the positive measures that were being taken, and there were a lot of those, to be reported in concise and non-technical language, being the timber construction, the other means of maximising natural daylight, the plans for solar PV, and the biomass boiler. It was also the process where we went through using a checklist did act as a double check, and one of the questions we specifically asked is, are there measures in place to address potential crowd overheating? I think there probably were, but they weren't very explicit, and that I think that was strengthened as a consequence, or possibly. But importantly, EIA is a holistic assessment of the construction, operation and decommissioning phases of the development, which means it also looks at related transport. So we felt this was very important because the stadium was moving from a more central location to next to a motorway junction, which would increase vehicle movements. And with a full 5,000 capacity attendance, it was estimated that there were nearly 2,000 one-way car movements likely to occur. So this led to a very interesting debate as to how we tackled it in the EIA in terms of what we could assume about electric vehicle uptake and also the sources of energy which would be used to charge them up. Those were the positive bits. Some of the challenges or further challenges, I think it's fair to say there are varying degrees of understanding and uncertainty with respect to how sensitive environmental receptors are to climate change. It's just the way it is at the moment. In many cases, we don't really know. And also, can we say anything meaningful given the likely lifespan of the development of 50 years? If you don't have modelling data, which we didn't in this case, is it acceptable to just say that it will meet best practice design standards so there isn't a significant effect? And if not, how do you define your significant effect? There is a risk of duplication or at least repetition. For example, we found that flood risk modelling already reflected the Environment Agency's climate change allowances guidance, so we didn't want to double count or confuse matters by introducing our own assessment criteria. And importantly, consultation is key to EIA, and that applies just as much to the climate change aspects. Lots of people have an interest, the local planning authority, the Environment Agency, Natural England, but who can advise, particularly and ideally holistically, on how to address climate change in your EIA. So, and I think I'm hopefully just about on time. Just to conclude really with some key points and tips. So I think it's fair to say addressing climate change in the EIA is a positive step forward. I just can't see how we could possibly ignore it. It's still very, very early days in terms of assessment methodologies, in terms of how we deal with uncertainty and how we avoid unnecessary duplication with other assessment and management tools, but I think that's fine. Importantly, it enables a holistic approach to be taken, which may highlight key aspects of a development which might otherwise receive limited attention. And importantly, it can highlight positive aspects, and that's important, and that's something where it's often quite easy to get developer buy-in, because understandably they want to highlight the positive aspects and reflect the good work that they are doing. It's not clear where the competency lies with consenting authorities and their statutory advisors, so you can see that that's tricky. Hopefully that may improve with time. But I think the point really that I want to end on really is, I think I'm strongly of the view that EIA practitioners should continue to approach the assessment of climate change with a good heart. Just get stuck in, give it a try. Continue to debate methodological challenges. It can be quite fun, quite interesting. And importantly, share examples of good practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Very interesting insights. For those watching, if you are able to stick around, please do so. Now is the time for some questions and answers with Joanna. So if you haven't already done so, if you ask a question with the Q&A function in your toolbar, that would be fantastic, and we'll go through as many as we can before we finish at 1 o'clock our time. But to start off with, you may remember that when you registered for the webinar, we asked you if you had any questions for Joanna, and we had a few in, so we're going to go through those first. So the first one is, should we always scope climate into an environmental statement, and how do you approach beneficial effects?
Great, thanks for that, Phil. The person who asked that, because I think they are two very good questions. Should we always scope in climate change? I think not necessarily, partly because there are no compulsory subjects, given that the ultimate test has to be likely significant effects, so there's nothing that we have to look at. But on the flip side, I think it's important that we're not too hasty to dismiss dismiss it and say, oh, we don't need to look at that because the project in question, perhaps it's an urban mixed-use development. Think maybe, oh well, it's got limited emissions, so you know we don't need to consider it in terms of likely significant effects, because the tricky thing is all these, and I think no project in its own right is well, there may be some are likely to have effects of real magnitude in isolation, but the key part here I think is that every project is a contributor to cumulative effects, which moves us ever closer to our scientifically defined threshold. So I think we do need to think about it and not dismiss it out of hand. I think it's fair if you propose to scope out, then I think it just needs to be detailed, the justification for this as to why it's been scoped out. And if that includes reference to design and other mitigation and measures to justify that, then that's fine. Then obviously take heed of the response that will hopefully come to this when you get the scoping opinion back from the determining authority. But a good question. Yeah, the beneficial effects is also an interesting one, and I did touch upon this because yes, we should be referring to these because the EU Directive Annex 4 says we should be looking at likely effects, both positive and negative. So very much we should be talking about the positive effects. I think my only concern is just to say be careful of greenwash, and remember that the EIA is an objective document, because a lot of the other documents you may see supporting the application are more promotional, and we just need to remember that we need to keep it objective. So do talk positive, but just be make sure it stays objective. And I think the one tricky thing is at the screening stage, because in theory, if you had if you had a positive effect that was of likely significance, you should be doing EIA. But I think that's really a bit of a nonsense that you would do a project, you would screen a project and say it needed EIA because it had a significant effect, but that was a positive one. But I think everybody would take a common sense approach to that. So yeah, two very good questions, I think.
Interesting stuff. Thank you very much for that answer and for the question. So the next one is, which you may have covered, apologies if I missed this. What is the matrix method of environmental impact assessment?
Yes, and thanks for that, Phil. So people who are EIA practitioners will be familiar with this. It's basically, it's a bit difficult without a graphic, but when you're defining significance, you're basically looking at your sensitivity of your receiving environment and your magnitude of effect. So with a matrix, you would have sensitivity on one axis of your receiving environment and your magnitude of effect on the other. So it's like a table, and then all your cells in your table, you would slide across your sensitivity, down your magnitude, and you'd come across, and that would give you your significance of effect. You might categorize sensitivity and magnitude as low, medium, and high. So you've got your low, medium, and high on both, and you kind of come across, and that will give you a category of significance, such as it's negligible or it's minor, moderate or major. So it's a bit difficult to explain without a visual, but for example, if you've got a low sensitivity of receiving environment and medium magnitude, you might put those together in your matrix and you would get effective moderate significance. Some people use them, they find them very helpful. Others say they're too rigid and that you need more professional judgment. And I think either's fine, as long as whatever you do, you explain how you get to your judgment of significance. And just quickly, does it work for climate change? I think it's tricky for greenhouse gas emissions because sensitivity of receiving environment is arguably uniformly high, so there aren't any different categories there. But it might be a more useful way of thinking for resilience and adaptation. Because if you've got a high value receptor and little resilience to climate change, it's more likely to be affected than a high value receptor that's very resilient to changes in climate. So it perhaps works better when you're looking at the resilience and adaptation side.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm just going to rattle through questions. I hope that's okay, Joanna. I think we have a few aspiring environmental professionals watching today, and I think this one comes from one of those. Is there any way I can gain experience in completing professional environmental impact assessments? For instance, voluntary and remote support, any data entry through online platforms, that kind of thing. I guess we're not looking for specifics, but in your experience, where did you gain your knowledge to start off with, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I guess I was lucky. When I started at LUC in '93, actually, people didn't even know there was such a thing as an MSc in EIA. So I was lucky, although I did all sorts of different things when I started, and I didn't necessarily do that much EIA in the beginning. But I guess it's like any, and I think it's probably very tricky at the moment, but I know various companies, I presume it's just the route of trying to gain experience, whether it's voluntary or through an internship with a company. There's certainly, in terms of the companies that do EIA, probably if you wanted to approach companies, I would suggest the IEMA have a quality mark system, so you have to constantly reapply. You get your environmental statements reviewed, your staff are interviewed. We've just been through our interviews. You have to produce various things, thought leadership, show you're contributing to debate. Hopefully we count because I'm doing this. So if you're interested in approaching a company, I would, there's a list of the IEMA EIA quality mark registrants, and they would be a good place to start, I think. I'm not sure if that's a question, but I think it's tricky, isn't it? But certainly in terms of getting experience in a professional capacity. I mean, obviously courses, but getting stuck in, I think that's probably the best way.
It's tricky in every discipline, I guess, but it's seeking out those opportunities to try and find a way you can maybe shadow people or have that kind of experience initially. But hopefully there's a few opportunities out there for you. So thank you very much for that. This is a bit of a longer one. If the project will be generally positive during the operational phase, i.e. public transport scheme, but have significant construction phase embodied emissions, how should the significance of these emissions be dealt with regarding impact within the EIA?
That's a very good point. It applies to climate change, it applies to other things such as ecology. You may have a lot of disturbance during construction, but positive benefits kind of longer term. I think that's fine, because I think, we can separate it out. You could produce a kind of net figure, and certainly with the wind farm work, we do quite a lot of that. There's a tool we use that gives you a net, so that you put in all the emissions that arise during the construction, and they're kind of offset against the emissions reductions during operation. So you net them off against each other, and you come up with a single answer. But there are tools that do that, which is fine. But if there aren't tools to do that, it's perfectly acceptable to present them separately. Not all construction effects are temporary, and they're not in this case. They're valid because it's going into the atmosphere in the same way as during operation. But for clarity, that there's no. You just want to give that information to the decision makers, so present it separately so they can form that judgment if you can't net the two off against each other.
Okay, interesting stuff. Should biodiversity net gain and environmental impact assessments work together and in alignment?
I think, the answer to that is yes, but I'm not sure. That's certainly something that's on my list of something that I need to find out more about, because obviously it's relevant to climate change. It's relevant as an EIA practitioner. I mean, I think it's one of these. There are parallels in that it's an area where you've got different tools, and they're all working for good reason, and they're all giving you answers, but they don't necessarily mesh together very well. And you certainly find that with climate change and some of the other work that's been done to meet development plan policy requirements. So I think the answer is yes. There's lots of good folk who know a lot more about that than I do. I mean, there are across climate change, and I think there are parallels in terms of how you use two different assessment tools and try and bring them together, so you just don't confuse when you present information to support an application. So good question, not sure I know the answer.
Okay, not a problem at all. I have merged into live questions now, by the way. There was only a couple that we had on the registration.
Yeah, I'm bluffing now. I had a bit of practice on the first couple, but I'm totally winging it now.
Okay. I'll continue with these. How would you, I don't know if you know how this works, but how would you compare the benefits and limitations of the environmental impact assessment and other assessment methods such as BREEAM? Do you have?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this is a similar question to the, and I think it is very valid, because the kind of importance of this as a topic area and of biodiversity, there are all these different tools. We use actually the BREEAM. Recently, we've been trying to use the BREEAM criteria and feed them into our EIA significance, so that if it meets certain standards that are required by BREEAM, or there's a commitment to doing that further down the line, which is really important, because inevitably with some of this, it's difficult to understand the numbers, what the emissions will be. But if there is that commitment and it will be properly implemented and monitored to deliver against BREEAM, then it will happen. And to be honest, that's the key thing. That's the most useful thing that we can report on. So we have tried to integrate, in that case we can do, to try and integrate some of the BREEAM criteria. So if it was it will meet the standard of excellent for X, Y, or Z, then we're trying to transparently say that means there isn't a significant effect. So we're trying to put it together and use them if we can.
Okay, brilliant. We've had a message from Maria Pooley at Not McDonald's.
Oh yes, big hand or whatever, round of applause to Maria, because she's the one who's been slogging away for months updating the guidance. So a virtual round of applause for Maria.
There you go.
Hard question.
There's a shout out for Maria. She has just said that the webinar from EIA on the forthcoming revised guidance for climate resilience and adaptations in environmental impact assessments should be on the 26th of June. So keep an eye out on the EIA webinar website. So please, I think
it has just been finalised. Yeah.
Yes. Excellent.
So it should be a good one. But thanks for that, Maria.
Okay, so that's a good.
Thanks for not asking a hard question.
We're going to stop for questions and answers there. So sorry if we haven't got to your questions. There are some brilliant questions in there. Sorry about that, but we are running out of time. So thank you very much again to Joanna for an insightful talk and very good answers to those questions. Thank you for that. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Before everyone disappears, we have some opportunities that you might be interested in. For example, the next couple of webinars in this series are coming up on the 20th of May and the 26th of May. Registration is open for both of those, as they were for this one If you haven't registered already, please check out the website that's on your screen and register with those for free. And then following this series of webinars, next month we have a World Environment Day Biodiversity special. World Environment Day is something we champion every year in and around the 5th of June. The biodiversity umbrella webinar topic links directly to the biodiversity global theme for World Environment Day 2020, which is set by UN Environment. Alongside the special webinar series, we're also developing a biodiversity toolkit that gives children, the general public and the environmental professionals ideas to help biodiversity locally and globally. And it should give you a lot of tips of what you can do individually. And if you want to be an environmental professional, then hopefully you'll have some really good ideas of what biodiversity professionals do and how they make a significant impact. So that will be launched quite soon, so keep an eye out for that. And then later on this year, Series 7 is based around the topic of natural capital, and we're looking for speakers for that at the moment. So if you're a Chartered Environmentalist or REnvTech, you have a project that you'd like to showcase and allow other environmental professionals to learn from, or some top tips or guidance on how you have implemented relevant standards such as EIA and that kind of thing, please do get in touch with me. You have my details at the start of the webinar. If you want to look back at previous webinars, or if you're interested in hearing more about becoming a CEnv or an REnvTech, for example, please check out the How to Become and Why Become recorded webinars that are on our website. You'll also find recordings from our previous series, which include a sustainable built environment and an innovation series, and there's quite a few on there. It will be joined by this recording as well quite soon. They're all available on our YouTube channel and on our website. If you go to our YouTube channel, you can subscribe to our channel and you'll be able to receive notifications of newly posted webinar recordings, which is always very useful. If you're waiting for the recording from the webinar last week, we experienced some technical problems, which means that we are having to re-record some of the content. So that will be with you as soon as we can get it to you. So that's about it from us today. If you are listening and well, thank you for listening and taking part. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to gain those notifications of new videos. Many, many thanks to Joanna again for our excellent talk and the content within. And we shall see you in the next webinar, which is next week, where we'll be talking about all things water security and climate change. So thank you very much for watching again, and please do stay safe.